Welcome to the Bricker and Speer podcast. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm grateful to be back in conversation with Darrell Bricker, the CEO of Ipsos Global Public Affairs, on the key developments and trends shaping Canadian politics. Today, we'll break down a new blockbuster poll from Ipsos on Canadian federal politics and discuss its implications for the next election. Darrell, thanks as always for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Darrell, we often say at The Hub, you got to be lucky to be good. And man, is this conversation occurring at a fortuitous time. Yesterday, Ipsos released a major poll on the state of Canadian federal politics that has really, I think, shook things up. I've seen it all over my social media feeds and all over the media. Before we delve into it, why don't you just give us the top line numbers? What are you finding and what's the degree of change that you've been observing over the past couple of weeks?
Well, what we have is the Conservatives now 2 points behind the Liberals. So the Liberals at 38, the Conservatives at 36. And it's not just that the Conservatives are coming back to the Liberals, it's the Liberals are picking up support from across the political parties. So we're seeing the Blocs down. The NDP, it really started off with the NDP vote collapsing. But now what's happened is I think that voters that were interested in voting for change, who weren't necessarily that comfortable with the affect around Pierre Poilievre and some of the things that he was saying, are now considering another option. So they're taking a soft look, I would say, at somebody who has a new car smell, and that's Mark Carney, and the reconstituted Liberal Party, or at least what the Liberal Party would like to see as the reconstituted Liberal Party. So it has some appeal. It's something that's new. People are giving it a bit of a test drive. We'll see whether it goes anywhere over any extended period of time.
Let's stick on your observations, Darrell, about the sources of liberal growth, because I think that's something that I've certainly been trying to understand in recent days. How should we understand it? To what extent are the Conservatives bleeding support to the Liberal Party versus the Liberals drawing on support from the Bloc Québécois, and as you say, consolidating support on the left or center left from the New Democrats?
Well, I think it started with the decline of the New Democrats. So if you take a look at not just our polling, but other polling that was taking place over the last couple of months, you see that the NDP has been steadily sliding. And, I think we've talked about on this before. I really do think that what we're seeing is more of a consolidation of the progressive vote as opposed to the New Democratic vote and the Liberal vote, and them coalescing behind what started to become a more viable progressive option, and that's a new leader Liberal Party. So that started it off. And then the second thing that took place is, as I mentioned before, Conservatives who were people who are voting for the Conservative Party, who are really voting more for change than they were specifically for the Conservatives. And this was the most guaranteed way of changing the Liberal Party, and particularly Justin Trudeau. Now that Justin Trudeau has gone and a new leader has come into place, they're prepared to go and take a look at other options for change. And so some of them have slid over and are taking a look at the Liberal Party, the new look Liberal Party with the new leader. And the Bloc Québécois, given that some of the issues that are also animating these other things in which people are seeing the threat from south of the border, and this idea that Canada is in a really existential economic conflict with the United States, maybe downing tools on some of the traditional sovereignist things and looking for somebody who can, or a party and a leader who can represent them to make sure that not only we are able to fight back against what's going on from the Americans, but also that we can create something in our own country that makes us more resilient. So the nationalist opportunity in there is less. So they're also taking a look at other options. So it would be too simple to say that Poilievre has lost the plot and it's all sliding away. No, it's not that at all. And I don't think that Poilievre has lost the plot. I think what's happened is that the plot has changed.
Yes.
And the elections changed as a result.
Let me convey to you one way that I've come to think about what we've seen in the past week or couple of weeks and get your reaction. You're probably familiar, Darrell, with the notion that in a period of economic turmoil, investors search for safe assets. And so it's often sort of axiomatic that people will turn, for instance, to U.S. treasuries. One way I've come to think of it is almost a political parallel here, where in this moment of turmoil, people are fleeing to what they perceive as a safe asset, and that is something that, notwithstanding the bruises and vulnerabilities that the Liberal brand has, it's still perceived by a lot of Canadians as a relatively safe option in Canadian politics. What do you think about that way of understanding what we're seeing play out?
Well, I think it without somebody like a Mark Carney leading the party, I wonder if that's really what it is. And you see last night, and just the way he presents himself, the way he speaks, he appears to be a safe pair of hands.
Yes.
And mature, somebody who's been through a few things. You can ask questions about some of this, but he has all of the presentation of somebody who can say, "Don't worry, I've got this." Whereas Poilievre on the other side is a bit of a firebrand. He's somebody who's advocating not just for change, but large change in Canada, and hasn't really found his voice or a place yet. Outside of the presentation, I would say that he had in his rally, and there were elements of that, I think, that show promise. But in this current context, other than finding ways to try and link Mark Carney to the previous administration, or continuing to try and run against Justin Trudeau in some form, he really hasn't found that place where he can be provide that sense of certainty about the future to Canadians under a government in which he would be responsible. So he's got work to do on that front, and not to say that it can't be done. I think people are opening their minds up to take a look at some of these things, but he does have some issues. Some of the polling that by the time this gets out, that will be coming out with our partners at Global, is really interesting on this. So we asked people a whole series of questions on, which party leader would do the best job of, the variety of things party leaders could be doing in this particular context. So who could do the best job of dealing with the United States? Who could do the best job of making sure that Canadians were protected, and we put in place the right programs and services and things to make sure that we're able to withstand what's going on. All of the things that were related to that. Pierre Poilievre is actually slightly ahead of Mark Carney on all of them. So it's not like he's not in the game on any of this. But the one in which he's way behind Mark Carney is who's most likely to roll over for and give Donald Trump what he wants. And on that one, Pierre Poilievre's 31, Mark Carney's number 6, or 6%. So that's the real big divergence. It's this parallel with Donald Trump and this affinity to Donald Trump that seems to be really undermining the idea of change that Pierre Poilievre wants to represent.
Yeah, it's fascinating. One of the themes of our conversations has been the notion that we're living in an era of political realignment and reconfiguration, and even to a certain extent entrepreneurialism. And in that context, centrism or so-called pragmatism is going to find a hard time with securing purchase within the population. It seems like what we're going through now is a bit of a challenge to that narrative, or that conversation we've been having, that at least in the current moment, Carney's presentation of himself as a pragmatist, which on the face of it seems kind of boring and incompatible with these broader trends, may actually find resonance.
Yeah, I guess when you're in an elevator and we kind of feel like we're trapped in this box that somebody else is moving it up and down, you want something that sounds a little bit more like elevator music, and that's Mark Carney. I mean, he does not come across as a guy of any extremes. On a scale of 1 to 10, he's a 4, 5, 6. He's not on one end of the scale or the other, and I think there's a certain amount of appeal that's related to this. But it does show what the challenges for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. I still think on the issue of change, Poilievre and the Conservatives are still in a good position. They still can present themselves as something different from the last 10 years. Yes. That works for them. The Liberals, all they have is this person, and maybe the brand that you were talking about before. And it's not like anybody really knows anything about this person. They're reading a lot of what they hope he's going to be into who he is. So there's an opportunity here for the Conservatives to define him in a way that he doesn't want to be defined, and to present him in a way in which his negatives are at least as high as Poilievre's. Poilievre doesn't have to beat Mark Carney. All they have to do is be equivalent.
Yeah.
And that's enough.
Yeah.
Because then the Conservative Party can beat the Liberal Party, and people don't want the Liberal Party back. So the challenge is really, really clear. But it's like that old Steve Martin joke, right? Which is, how do you become a millionaire and pay no taxes? First, get $1 million. So I can say this. It sounds like it's really easy to do, but it's actually quite difficult to do. But what they have to do is they have to drive up Mark Carney's negatives. They don't have to make Pierre Poilievre necessarily that positive. They just have to get them to equivalent, and then they can fight on other fronts with the Liberal Party. But every time I say this, my wife, who's a very reasonable, good citizen, hates to hear these kinds of things because the type of politics that she doesn't like. So it's also very risky for anybody to do this, but that's really the challenge. It reminds me of the 1988 federal election. You and I always get into these conversations about history, Sean, yes. And here's a good history lesson, because I'm old enough to have been around that. It was actually the first election campaign I ever worked on the campaign, and I was Alan Gregg's research assistant. I know Alan's now appearing on coming on the Hub occasionally, which is great, because I think he's a very bright guy, and founded the kind of industry that I'm in now. But in that election campaign, what happened was the Conservatives started off just like the Conservatives are starting now, the Brian Mulroney Conservatives at that time. Really, it was just, we're doing a great job. We're all about continuing things on. Everything should just remain as they are, and you'll be good. It's kind of like sort of the way Pierre Poilievre is saying, what we promised you over the last 2 years, we're going to deliver, and everything is going to be fine. And then what ended up happening is the Liberals ran this brilliant ad in which they had, two sets of hands, a Canadian set of hands, an American set of hands over this big map. And it was shot beautifully. It was this incredible thing. And the last line of the ad was the American hands grabbing an eraser over this Canadian map and said, there's one more line I'd like to talk to you about. And they started erasing the line.
Yes.
That completely changed the campaign. Changed the campaign. And everybody had to do a reset. And that's the kind of thing that's going on right now for the Conservatives. There's a reset going on because the issues have changed. And the way that the Progressive Conservatives under Brian Mulroney dealt with that was that they figured out, very much like what the situation is now for the Conservative Party against the Liberals, was the whole thing relied on John Turner's credibility. He and Alan Gregg's famous for this phrase, bomb the bridge. So the bridge that you went over was John Turner's credibility. He's doing this because he really believes in it, or is he doing this because he just wants to win an election and is trying to save himself? So the Tories went all in on going after John Turner and questioning his motives, and reduced his credibility, which also reduced the liberal vote, which is why the Conservatives won in the end. I mean, the rhetoric about the remembrances, and journalists do this all the time. They come up with these narratives about what election campaigns were about. That was the free trade election. Yes. Except nobody knew what was in the free trade agreement. It was just, which one of these two people do you trust? And what the Conservatives did, Progressive Conservatives did very effectively, was they diminished John Turner. And as a result of that, they won the election campaign. This is what Pierre Poilievre faces now. There is a great lesson in how this is done. That's how it's done. So let's see if they can do it.
Well, it prompts the question, if you were advising them, what line of arguments would they deploy to essentially challenge the credibility of Mark Carney as a prime minister and Liberal leader?
This is a person who has 30 years at least of public life, who has been on camera everywhere that you could be, in places he should have been, in places maybe that were somewhat questionable, aligning himself with certain people, certain ideas. He was involved in certain big decisions that people might like or might not like. It almost doesn't matter. You don't have to come up with a bullet. This is a shotgun. It's the cumulative effect of everything you can throw at him that will bring him down. And the job isn't to make Pierre Poilievre better. It's just to make them equivalent. And if you can make them equivalent, then the Conservatives can go on about the type of change that they want to bring on. But if they don't throw a stick in Mark Carney's wheels on his bicycle, he's going to ride away with this. And he probably is on a bicycle, given his position on climate change.
On your point about the public search for what it feels are safe hands, what, if any, adjustments should Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives make to their own presentation to reassure them that if they ultimately vote for him, he is someone that they ultimately can trust with power. Would you recommend, for instance, possibly moderating on certain issues for the purposes of sending that signal? I've heard different arguments, including even from people I know, that defunding the CBC maybe is something that the party revisits in the context of Trump's provocations and the reset political landscape.
Well, no, I don't think so. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to walk away from any of the things that they've been doing. They've been so adamant about it and so focused on it. And at some point in this campaign, if what I described needs to happen on the leadership aspect of this happens, then going back to some of those things that the Liberal Party did in the past and the Conservative Party would like to change is probably not a bad thing. They do have to have a program, but they also have to come up with some way of bringing Mark Carney back to the pack. That's the first goal. And then after that, emphasizing what it is that people really, really care about at the moment, which is a sense of security about what is going to happen today and in the near future.
Yeah.
Spending a whole bunch of time talking about the last 10 years. Yes, you have to run against Justin Trudeau, but Justin, it kind of makes it too easy for the other side. I mean, right now, it's really interesting to watch. I mean, Mark Carney is running against Donald Trump, and Pierre Poilievre's running against Justin Trudeau. Well, one of those people is gone.
Yes.
And at some point, they're going to be running against each other. It'll be Mark Carney running against Pierre Poilievre.
Well said.
So the question is, how is Pierre Poilievre going to frame Mark Carney? He's in the most favorable light that he could be in right now.
Yes.
So what are you going to do to bring him back to you? And at the same time, he's going to make you try and make you look like Donald Trump light. Don't give him the ammunition to do that, because that's where you're extremely vulnerable. As I went through the numbers for you just a second ago, I don't know if I went through this, but he's the leader who's perceived by Canadians to be the most likely to give in to Donald Trump.
Yes. Yeah, you're saying.
That's the stuff that you have to work on. And the affect around Trump, the way he presents himself, is not something that will go over well with Canadians. They don't want a Canadian version of Donald Trump.
So if you were Pierre Poilievre and you were searching for ways to build distance in the minds of Canadians between you and the unpopular U.S. president, what might be certain ones that you seize on? I'm thinking, for instance, of Poilievre's positioning on the war in Ukraine in recent days, which in my mind, both I think substantively but also politically, has been important to create that distance between him and the president and broader voices in the Republican Party. Are there others that you can think of that Poilievre will want to accentuate in the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, because I think the agenda sets up for him, and it's such a good agenda. Mark Carney's taken a bunch of it. Like things like infrastructure projects, things that we can do on productivity, things that we need to do on taxation to get the economy rolling in the right direction, putting money back in the pockets of taxpayers, reducing the size of government and the effect of government on people's day-to-day lives, making Canada work again. So that the thing about Canada being broke is Canadians don't feel broke. Canadians don't feel broken. This is a bit of a pivot maybe that needs to be made on the Canada's broken argument. It's the Canadians themselves don't feel broken. They feel that the government institutions that are around them and the things that are supposed to be in charge, they're broken. They don't feel that they themselves are broken. They think this is a great country. They love this country. They're really offended by what Donald Trump said about this country. And there is a whole wellspring of support that you can plug into about how our institutions haven't necessarily favored that. And there's lots of evidence there. And by the way, it's such a good argument. Mark Carney's saying it now too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been struck. You mentioned that Carney is running against Trump, and of course that's true. But I've been struck the extent to which he's also seemingly running against Justin Trudeau on a lot of issues. Last night in the English language debate, he was the most forceful of any of the candidates in terms of acknowledging failures on the part of the Trudeau government with respect to immigration policy and economic and fiscal policy. Moving forward, should he become leader, he is going to have to possibly appoint a cabinet that will be comprised of people who, of course, ran under Prime Minister Trudeau's political banner. To what extent Darrell, is there an opportunity for the Conservatives to challenge this notion that Mark Carney represents an outsider who himself has distance from the parts of the Trudeau government's agenda that people don't like?
Well, they need better evidence than what they have right now, because the evidence they have right now is getting them to the Liberals at 38 and them at 36. So It doesn't seem to be really sticking. That may be because the context isn't right at the moment. Maybe it seems like it's too much in the past. Maybe it's too much of a stretch for people. But I think, yes, there's this linkage that needs to be made with Justin Trudeau, but you need to start taking on Mark Carney as Mark Carney.
Yeah, interesting.
And you may really want to run against Justin Trudeau, but it's too easy for him to say, I'm not him.
Yeah, interesting. I want to take up something you posted on X this week that struck me, admittedly, Darrell, as a bit counterintuitive. It looks like if these numbers broadly hold over the coming weeks, that the New Democrats, by and large, won't be a factor in a general election campaign. There will be, particularly in English Canada, large swaths of the country that amount to essentially two-party races. My instinct is that would favor the Liberals, but you posted on X that you're not so sure about that. Why don't you explain what you mean?
Well, you're going to see it play out in the Ontario election tomorrow. And where you're going to see pickups for the Conservatives, most likely, because the numbers are showing that Ford is poised to win a bigger majority than he has now, the seats that are available for him to win are mostly from the NDP. So, the old resource towns, union towns, in more remote parts of the country are accessible to the Conservatives. Some of them are still in the hands of the NDP. Border towns that are affected, like in Niagara Falls and Windsor, where the Liberals and the NDP have had seats. Even places like Hamilton, Ontario, where traditionally more NDP, more Liberal. There used to be a Liberal Labour Party in Ontario as well, which was interesting. Yeah. But those types of seats are now accessible to the Conservatives, so they're going to pick those up. They're available to Pierre Poilievre too. But what's happening is that the downtown vote is moving from the NDP to the Liberals. Yes. And so it looks like the Liberals have a 2-point lead, which should be put them in pretty good shape. But they may be just racking up more numbers in the downtowns rather than actually challenging in the car commuting suburbs to the extent that they need to in order to win. I mean, they're ahead by 4 in Ontario. They probably need to be ahead by a few more before they're really doing something strong in the 905. So even a 2-point lead for the Liberal Party is still very, very competitive for the Conservatives. But yes, the dynamic of the NDP Conservative switches, you can also see them in places like British Columbia.
Yes.
They're a real thing now.
Before we started recording, you joked only partly facetiously that the release of this polling results have attracted some animus from partisan Conservatives. But what about the argument, Darrell, that people just need to relax a bit, that it was predictable that the Liberals were not going to stay in the high teens or early 20s, and that the attention that a leadership race has given the party would naturally lead it to rise? Maybe it's risen a bit more than some anticipated, but that this was by and large predictable. And what really will matter in the coming weeks is, as people get to know Mark Carney, what they come to think of him, and whether he demonstrates that he's capable of essentially prime time. In other words, what's the argument against the idea that Conservatives need to just chill out a bit, if I can put it that way?
Well, one of the things that you see in politics is people can make those kinds of timing sort of arguments that, time will heal things. Yes. And, there's some possibility of that, but wouldn't you like to take advantage of the time that you have to get yes. things going in the direction that you need to get it going? Because the longer that this continues, the Conservatives don't have momentum, and political campaigns in Canada are short. You don't yes. have a lot of time to change momentum around. So there's a very good likelihood of, the next couple of weeks, we start seeing that the Liberals don't just show in our poll that they moved ahead, but they start showing in other polls that they moved ahead. And instead of 2 points, it's 5 points. It's going to be irresistible for the Liberals to go.
Yes.
And at the moment, there's an opportunity to define your opponent in a way that's favorable to you. And this is the Conservatives. Every day lost now is a day you're probably not going to get back later. So the time to go is now. I was always funny, when I was in, politics, and you were in politics as well in the past. I used to refer to these guys as the timing junkies, right? It was all about calling the things at exactly the right time. And what you find out is every time passes them by.
Yes.
And, the right timing is only in the rearview mirror. You don't know what the right timing is at the time. The right timing for anything is now. If the leadership of the Liberal Party is available and you're Mark Carney and you want to be the leader of, you want to be Prime Minister of Canada, don't wait, go now, because it might not be available next time. Events can change things. So you need to go as quickly as possible. And that applies to defining your opponent.
Yeah.
Now. Now.
Yeah. Well said, though. Just in parentheses, we could go back and find people saying in December and January that it made no sense Carney was running because the party's chances of winning the election were essentially nil. It's possible I even said that at some point. And as you say, what your poll shows today is that those underlying developments have fundamentally changed, and we find ourselves in a highly competitive race. As we wrap up, I have to ask about the ongoing salience of these issues and how that itself may influence an eventual election campaign. Should we take for granted, for instance, Darrell, that we'll have higher levels of voter turnout, that we will have a more attentive and galvanized population? And if so, understanding the turnout patterns of different demographics and so on, how might that influence the eventual election outcome?
Okay, so you get people turning out to elections to vote when they feel the election has consequence.
Yes.
And you usually feel that the election has consequence when there's a big issue on the table in which there's a disagreement between the two major parties. The problem on free trade, on US-Canada relations, is there doesn't really seem to be a lot of big disagreement between the two parties. There isn't two sides like there was in 1988.
Yes.
The other thing is that while people might be looking at Mark Carney and the Liberal Party, the new version of whatever the Liberal Party is, they've got the air freshener in the car, whatever it is, as with a certain amount of relief, there doesn't appear to be a lot of passion behind any of this at the moment. So I don't know that really drives up voter turnout. The other thing that really drives up voter turnout is a real belief that there's going to be change that's created as a result of the election, which actually Pierre Poilievre has the potential to really demonstrate. So of the people who are on the stage at the moment, the ones that can really drive, and were until very recently really driving the likelihood that there would be higher turnout in the election campaign, I think was the Conservatives. We'll see going forward. Maybe all of a sudden there's Carney mania. I don't see any signs of it at the moment, but maybe there is. But as I said before, he seems to be more relief than people like passionately, I'm all in for Mark Carney, like Justin Trudeau was in 2015.
Yes.
By the way, Stephen Harper was a leader like that, where there was never really any passion around Stephen Harper.
Yes.
They thought he was just kind of like the best option at the time.
Yes. But the lesson from my former boss's time in office is that you can become the fifth longest serving prime minister with that kind of level of public support. Darrell, what a great conversation! What a timely conversation! It almost feels like we can't wait to do these every 2 weeks, given how fast moving the political environment is. At minimum, we'll be back to you in a couple of weeks, and maybe before then. But thanks as always for taking the time to speak with me.
Thanks, Sean.